Welcome. If you're here, perhaps your heart has been whispering lately. A quiet ache, a soft confusion, or maybe just the sense that something in life no longer fits the way it used to. Maybe you've been carrying a question for a long time, one that has no easy answer. Or maybe the future has gone silent and you don't know what comes next. And that's okay. Because here, in this space of stillness and story, you are invited to rest, to stop searching, to stop fixing, to stop trying to make sense of a world that refuses to be pinned down. Zen does not offer answers. Zen offers presence. And sometimes, in presence, we find something deeper than understanding. We find peace. Tonight, I will tell you stories. Stories that don't try to teach, but gently awaken. Stories that don't demand belief, but invite you to breathe. Each one will lead you closer to the heart of the unknown and show you that even in the fog, there is still ground beneath your feet. So lie back, let go. Let your breath return to itself. Let your shoulders fall. You are safe now. The journey begins not with a step, but with a stillness. Are you ready? Then close your eyes and listen. Part 1. Whisper from the Unknown. It began not with a sound, but with the absence of one. A man named Elias stood by the edge of a windless field, where the grass did not sway, where the sky held its breath, and even the birds had forgotten their songs. He had walked for many days, though time had melted in the folds of his robe and the dust of his sandals. He no longer knew what he was looking for, only that something had been calling. It wasn't grief, it wasn't desire, it was something quieter, like a whisper from the unknown. He remembered leaving the city. The buildings had become too loud, the walls too close. He remembered selling everything he owned, not out of anger or despair, but as if gently letting go of a coat that no longer fit. He remembered the way people looked at him when he said, "I think I've lost my place in the story." They laughed, or they frowned, or they changed the subject. But Elias had meant it, and so he walked away. Now, here in this field of stillness, he wondered if perhaps there was no story at all, only this moment, and perhaps that was enough. But then came the sound, a low rustle, not wind, not animal, not dream. It came from behind the tall bamboo grove near the edge of the field. Elias turned, not startled, but curious. He stepped closer, the earth soft beneath his feet, as if even the land itself was holding him gently. And there, sitting cross-legged beneath a crooked tree, was a figure in gray robes, eyes closed, skin weathered like old wood, silent. The figure opened one eye, then the other, and smiled. "You've arrived," the figure said. Elias blinked. "I didn't know I was coming." "Most don't," said the figure, "but they come anyway." Elias sat down slowly, across from the man. A strange warmth spread through his chest, not from comfort, but from the sheer simplicity of the moment. The way the breeze moved again, as if time had just remembered itself. The scent of wild jasmine drifting through the air. The sound of his own breath, unhurried and deep. The man in gray robes tilted his head. "Do you know what brought you here?" "No," Elias said. "Only that something stopped making sense, and I got tired of pretending I understood." The man smiled again. "That is a fine beginning." They sat in silence, not an awkward one, but a silence full of presence, like the space between musical notes, the pause that lets you hear what truly matters. Then the man said, "Would you like to hear a story?" Elias nodded. "Yes, but I don't want to be taught. I only want to feel less lost." The man closed his eyes. "Good, because stories are not for teaching. They are for remembering what the mind has forgotten, but the heart still knows. And then he began. There once was a lantern that refused to be lit. It sat at the edge of a cliff, facing the sea, unmoved by wind or time. Travelers passed it often, tried to light it with flint and match, with candles and oil. Nothing worked. The lantern remained cold, its glass dusty, its purpose unfulfilled. One day, a child wandered by, alone, small, forgotten by the caravan that had moved too quickly for his little legs. The child sat beside the lantern, not trying to light it, not asking it why it did not shine. He simply sat and waited. The night grew dark. The winds howled. The stars blinked in sympathy. And then, without a spark, without a match, the lantern glowed. Not a fire, not a flame, but a soft blue light that pulsed like a heartbeat. The child smiled. The lantern did too, though no one saw it move. They stayed there, the child and the lantern, both glowing from within, needing nothing more than to be seen and accepted. And the world, for a moment, became whole again. When the man finished the story, Elias noticed that the sun had moved, the shadows had shifted, and something in his chest had loosened. "I don't understand," Elias said. "You're not meant to," the man replied. "Understanding is the craving of the mind. Peace lives elsewhere." Elias looked at the bamboo swaying in the wind that had returned. "So the story is just to be heard?" "Yes," said the man, "just like the wind, just like your breath, just like life." Elias closed his eyes. He didn't know what came next. He didn't know where he would sleep tonight. He didn't know who this man was or what he was doing in this silent field. But he knew one thing now. He was no longer running, and maybe that was enough. The man in gray robes spoke once more, his voice like warm tea poured into a quiet cup. "I will tell you more if you wish. 25 stories for 25 layers of forgetting. Each one a step, not forward or back, but inward, toward the still point where uncertainty becomes not a problem, but a place to rest." Elias breathed in deeply and nodded. The man smiled once more, and the stories began. Part 2. The Bamboo and the Wind. The next morning came not with a sunrise, but with a shift in the weight of silence. Elias opened his eyes beneath the soft gray light of dawn. He had slept by the tree, wrapped in nothing but stillness and breath. The man in gray robes, still unnamed, was already awake, kneeling beside a small pot suspended above a fire that crackled without smoke. "I dreamed of water," Elias said, rubbing his eyes. "Of a river that flowed backwards and whispered my name." The man smiled. "That's how truth often arrives, quietly and in strange directions." He handed Elias a cup of warm barley tea. The taste was simple, almost invisible, but it lingered in the chest like kindness. Without prompting, without any signal, the man began to speak again, his voice soft as wind weaving through leaves. "Let me tell you a story, one I learned not from books, but from a grove that never left me. There was once a bamboo grove high in the eastern hills, where the winds were fierce and the seasons sharp. Most trees avoided that land, too cold in winter, too brutal in storm. But the bamboo thrived there, slender, fragile-looking, and green. The villagers nearby often said, 'The bamboo is weak, it bends too easily.' And indeed it did. When the wind howled, the bamboo would bow, sometimes all the way to the ground. Other trees cracked, broke, or lost their leaves, but the bamboo remained. A young boy named Kian lived in that village. He was small, curious, and often afraid, especially of storms. Whenever thunder roared or the wind shook his house, Kian would hide beneath the floorboards, holding his breath, praying for stillness. One day, a great storm swept through the hills, the kind that splits trees and swallows rooftops. When it passed, the village was wounded. Old oaks had fallen, roofs had crumbled, but the bamboo grove still stood, green and silent in the mist. Kian, puzzled, wandered up the path toward the grove. He stood among the stalks, listening to them creak and sigh. Then he heard something strange, a voice, thin, high, and musical, coming from the bamboo itself. "You fear the wind, little one," the voice said. Kian froze. Who said that? The bamboo swayed. We did, all of us, we who bend. The boy trembled. But why don't you break like the trees? The bamboo replied, because we do not resist. We move with the wind, not against it. We trust the storm to pass, and we return. Kian sat down, listening with wide eyes. Another voice, deeper now, added, strength is not in standing still. It is in returning to stillness after being moved. And another, whispering like a breath, said, to be rigid is to snap. To be soft is to survive. From that day forward, Kian visited the grove whenever storms arrived. He still felt fear, but he learned to breathe with it, to watch it move through him like wind through leaves. As he grew older, he became known as the Calm One, a healer, a wise man. And in his garden, he planted bamboo, not because it was strong, but because it knew how to bow. The man in gray robes fell silent. Elias had not moved. His tea had cooled in his hand. That story, Elias whispered, feels like something I knew once, but forgot. The man nodded. Many truths are like that, not new, just uncovered. I always thought strength meant standing tall, Elias said, being firm, solid, unshakable. Stone shatters, said the man. Bamboo sings. They sat quietly as the wind stirred the grass, and Elias began to feel it, not the story, but the space beneath it, a remembering, a loosening. He thought of the arguments he once clung to, the titles he wore like armor, the beliefs he defended until they hollowed him. And he saw it now. None of it had made him safer, only harder. The man in gray robes poured another cup. In times of great uncertainty, he said, do not seek to become stronger. Seek to become softer. Let the wind teach you its dance. Elias breathed in, and for the first time in many years, he did not brace himself against the unknown. He let it in, let it move through, let it bend him gently toward a new shape. The bamboo swayed somewhere in the distance, and the day began. Part 3, The Monkey and the Grapes. That afternoon, the clouds rolled in, not with thunder, but with a hush so complete it felt like the world itself had paused to listen. Elias and the man in gray robes sat under the crooked tree once more, the air rich with the scent of wet earth and something older than language. They had not spoken in hours, But the silence did not feel empty. It felt patient, as if waiting for something to ripen. Then the man said, "Would you like another story?" Elias smiled faintly. "I think the stories are finding me more than I'm finding them." The man chuckled, voice like warm sand. "That is how the deepest teachings work. They don't demand attention. They arrive when we're quiet enough to notice." He leaned back, palms resting in his lap, and with no further ceremony, began. There was once a monkey who lived alone at the edge of a crumbling temple, deep within a forgotten forest. He was clever, quick, and fiercely independent. His days were spent leaping through branches, searching for sweet fruits, dodging snakes and storms, always on the move. But there was one thing he loved above all else: the grapes. They grew in a secluded part of the forest, hidden behind a curtain of vines and silence. They were rare, dark, and full of juice that shimmered like stars. And the monkey believed that these grapes were his. He guarded them, snarled at birds, threw stones at other monkeys, slept curled beneath the vines with one eye open. He was afraid of losing them, not because he needed them to live, but because they made him feel important. One dry season, the grapes began to vanish. Not stolen, not eaten, just fading. One by one, the clusters shriveled, their color draining, until only a single bunch remained, tucked high in the branches, just out of reach. The monkey panicked. He climbed the tree, reached, grasped, and finally caught hold of them. But the grapes were inside a narrow clay jar, left, perhaps, by an old monk long ago. The opening was wide enough for his hand to slip in, but too narrow for a clenched fist to come out. Still, he held tight. He would not let go. Hours passed. His arm grew tired. His body ached, but he kept clinging. "I must have these grapes," he thought. "If I let go, they'll be gone. If I hold on, I win." But the jar would not yield, and neither would the grapes. A wind came, a storm followed, and still he clung, soaked and shaking. Only when lightning struck a nearby tree, splitting it with a thunderous cry, did the monkey flinch. In that moment of terror, his fingers opened, and just like that, his hand slipped free. The grapes remained in the jar, untouched, uneaten. The monkey stared at them, then at his hand, then at the jar again. He laughed. For the first time in seasons, he laughed until the rain washed the fear from his fur. The next day, he left the grove. He never looked back. And for the rest of his life, whenever he saw a jar, he bowed to it, not for what it held, but for what it had taught him. That sometimes freedom is not in getting what you want, but in letting go of what you can't hold without pain. The man stopped speaking. The leaves rustled as if the story had become part of the trees. Elias exhaled slowly. His fingers had curled unconsciously during the tale, gripping the hem of his robe. He opened his hand. "I was that monkey," he said softly. "All my life, I chased things that made me feel secure, loved, powerful. And when they slipped away, I blamed the world. But I never saw that I was the one holding on too tightly." The man nodded. The hand that clutches cannot receive. Elias looked out over the field. The grasses danced with the wind. Letting go feels like dying, he said. It is a kind of death, the man replied, but only of the false self, the one who believes it must control everything to survive. And what's left after that self dies? The man smiled gently. Space, breath, possibility. They sat in silence again, but this silence had changed. It no longer pressed from above. It rose from within. Elias thought of the titles he had once carried, the roles, the expectations, each like a grape in a jar, too narrow to escape with a clenched fist. And he began, slowly, softly, to loosen his grip. Not on the world, but on the idea that he needed it to obey. The wind picked up, and Elias did not resist. He let it pass through him, let it carry away a little more of the weight. The man poured fresh tea. In this world of uncertainty, he said, clinging is the heaviest burden, and letting go is the lightest step. They raised their cups in silence and drank to the wisdom of empty hands. Part 4. The Fisherman and the Dragon. That night, the fire crackled with a gentler rhythm, as if echoing the slow breath of the earth. Elias sat with his knees drawn to his chest, watching the orange glow flicker against the bark of the crooked tree. The stars above were veiled, but the wind carried the sound of distant water, a lake perhaps, or a memory. The man in gray robes stirred the embers, then looked up. Have you ever felt like the future is chasing you? Elias smiled faintly. Every day of my life. Then, said the man, you may understand this next story. It's about a fisherman who believed the future had teeth. And he began in a voice low and dreamlike. There was once a fisherman named Tao who lived by a vast and quiet lake, ringed by mountains that pierced the mist like thoughts through silence. He had fished that lake every morning since his youth. It gave him food, rhythm, and peace. But in his 50th year, a rumor came from the northern villages. A dragon had been seen beneath the surface, a great serpent of shadow and gold, said to awaken in times of change. The villagers whispered warnings. The lake is no longer safe. The dragon brings misfortune. Stay on land. Trust the dry world. Tao, curious but cautious, continued to fish. But the whispers followed him. The joy he once found in casting his net now trembled with the question, what if the dragon is real? He began to scan the lake with every ripple, flinching at every shift in light. His hands, once steady, grew tense. His nets tangled more often. He caught fewer fish. One day, after a long, anxious morning, Tao sat on the shore and wept, not from fear, but from the loss of his peace. He whispered, "Where did it go? The quiet I once knew." As the sun dipped low, he heard a voice, deep and soft, like water over stone. "You've not lost the quiet. You've only turned away from it." Tao looked up. There, standing in the shallows, was a woman robed in mist. She held no staff, no symbols of power, only a stillness that made the wind pause. "Are you the dragon?" Tao asked. "I am the watcher of it," she said, "and of you." Tao bowed his head. "I've ruined my days. The fear has taken everything." She knelt beside him. "Fear does not take, it distracts. It pulls your gaze from what is here to what might be." Tao touched the surface of the lake. His reflection wavered. "I used to love this water." "And you still can," she said, "but only if you return." Return to what? To the cast, to the breath, to this net, this sky, this fish, this moment. She stood. The dragon is not your enemy. It is only your future, unseen, unknowable, and therefore imagined. She placed her hand on his chest. Live in the cast, not the question. And then she was gone. Elias sat perfectly still, as if the story had wrapped itself around his spine. "The dragon," he whispered, "is the future?" The man in gray robes nodded. "More precisely, it is our fear of what has not yet come, and our habit of living in that fear." Elias traced the rim of his cup. "How much of my life," he said softly, "have I spent running from things that haven't even happened?" The man did not answer. He only added more wood to the fire. After a long silence, Elias said, "When I was younger, I thought awareness meant planning, preparing for every possible threat." "And now?" asked the man. Elias looked up. "Now I think awareness is noticing that the present is enough." The man smiled, not with his lips, but with his whole being. "The lake is always here," he said, "but the fisherman only sees it when he's not chasing dragons in his mind." A distant owl called from the trees. Elias closed his eyes, and for the first time in many years, he didn't wonder what tomorrow would bring. He simply sat and listened to the lake inside him. Part 5. The Hermit and the Paper Sky. The next morning was born in silence, the kind of silence that hangs not as absence, but as presence too deep for words. A thin mist lay across the field. The fire had burned low in the night, leaving behind faint curls of ash that danced in the soft morning breeze. Elias sat with his back against the tree, watching the sky shift from slate to silver. The man in gray robes was sitting nearby, eyes closed, palms upturned, as if holding something invisible. When he opened them, he smiled. "Some mornings," he said, "the sky is made of paper." Elias tilted his head. "What does that mean?" The man stirred the ash with a twig. "It means the world feels fragile, and sometimes so do we." He looked toward the soft sky. "There's a story I carry on days like this. It was given to me by someone who no longer needed it. Would you like to hear it?" Elias nodded, and so the man began. There was once a hermit who lived in the hills above a quiet village. He had no name, or perhaps too many. The villagers called him Sky Reader, because every morning he would climb to the highest ridge and study the sky for hours. Not for weather, not for omens, but for something he could not explain. Some said he was mad. Others said he had once been a great monk who had seen too much. But children loved him, for he made birds from rice paper and sent them flying on the wind with messages written on their wings. One day, the sky remained gray for many days. No clouds, no storms, just flat, unbroken gray. The hermit grew restless. He folded more birds, but they refused to fly. He lit incense, but the smoke fell instead of rising. He waited, and still the sky would not speak. Frustrated, he decided to make a sky of his own. He gathered paper, parchment, scrolls, cloth scraps, and stitched together a canopy. He painted it blue with crushed indigo flowers, dotted it with golden stars, and stretched it wide across the ridge using bamboo poles. "There," he said, "now the sky will shine." But as the villagers climbed to see it, A wind rose from the valley, not harsh, but steady, and the paper sky, beautiful and fragile, began to tear. Not at once, but slowly, as if mourning its own unraveling. One by one, the seams split. The stars fluttered away like moths, and the blue bled into the clouds. The hermit fell to his knees. "I only wanted beauty," he whispered. "I only wanted to know." A voice behind him spoke, quiet and firm. "Then you must stop trying to make the sky and let the sky make itself." It was a child, no older than 7, barefoot and bright-eyed. The hermit looked up. "But I cannot bear the gray." The child sat beside him. "Gray is only the color of not knowing. It does not mean the sky is gone. It means it's becoming." They sat together in silence, and then the wind shifted again. A tear in the clouds, a shaft of gold. The sky returned, not with drama, but with grace. And the hermit never tried to paint it again. Instead, he folded one last paper bird. On its wings he wrote, "Let it be, let it come, let it pass." And he let it go. It soared higher than any bird he had made before. When the story ended, Elias felt as if he had been gently unknotted. He closed his eyes and whispered, "I've made so many paper skies." The man in gray robes looked at him with deep kindness. "We all do. We build them from plans, expectations, from ideas of how the world should behave." Elias sighed, "But they always tear." "And in the tearing," the man said, "is the gift. The sky you didn't create is often the one that heals you." They sat as the mist began to lift. A real sky emerged, muted blues and soft whites, neither dramatic nor dull, just honest. Elias smiled faintly. "I don't know what comes next." "That's good," said the man. "Not knowing is fertile ground. From it grows peace." They drank tea in silence. Above them, a bird, perhaps paper, perhaps not, circled once and vanished into the mist. Part 6. The Fisherman and the Dragon. There was once a fisherman named Aso who lived at the edge of a lake so wide the other shore vanished into mist. Each day he cast his net into the waters before sunrise, pulling in just enough to feed himself and sometimes the monks who lived in the hills above. But Aso was not like other fishermen. He rarely spoke. He never bargained at the market, and no one ever saw him take more than he needed. What no one knew was that Aso had a secret. He believed a dragon lived in the lake, not a monstrous fire-breathing beast, but an old, silent being whose presence could only be felt when the world grew still. He had never seen it, never even heard it, but sometimes, just as the light touched the water, he would feel a deep pulse beneath his boat, as if something ancient stirred in the dark. He called it the still dragon. And for years, he fished above its resting place. He never told anyone, not even the monks, but he had made a silent vow. "I will only cast my net when I am present. If my mind wanders, I do not deserve what the lake offers." And so, Aso practiced a strange ritual. Before each cast, he would sit, eyes closed, and wait for the moment his breath matched the rhythm of the ripples. Only then would he lower his net. Some days he caught nothing, but he never blamed the water. He would smile and say, The dragon must still be dreaming. One morning, as the mists hung heavier than usual, a young monk appeared at the shore. He watched Aso from the distance, noticed how he sat quietly, how he didn't chase the fish, how he seemed to listen to something the monk could not hear. After a while, the monk approached. "Master fisherman," he said, "I've been told your catch is always clean, never greedy, and yet you never rush. What's your secret?" Aso looked up. "I wait for the dragon," he said. The monk blinked. "The what?" Aso smiled and invited the monk to sit beside him in the boat. They drifted into the mist. No speaking, only paddling. And when they reached the center of the lake, Aso set the oar down. "Now, we wait," he whispered. The monk tried to meditate, tried to silence his thoughts, but the questions came fast. Is there really a dragon? Why won't he fish now? What if this is a waste of time? Minutes passed, then hours, and still nothing. No cast, no sound, only ripples and breath. Finally, the monk broke the silence. "I feel nothing," he said. "No dragon, no signal, just stillness." Aso looked at him. "Exactly." The monk frowned. "I don't understand." Aso nodded gently. "You came here to learn how to fish, but Zen is not about catching. It is about presence." He reached over, placed a hand on the monk's chest. "Right now, your heart is like a net already full of questions, fears, noise. How can the dragon rise if there is no room for it?" He turned back to the lake. "The dragon is not a creature. It is the moment when you are no longer looking." The monk fell silent, and in that silence, something changed. Not outside, but inside. He noticed how the wind brushed his cheek, how the boat creaked like an old song, how his breath, finally, was no longer trying to get anywhere. And just then, without warning, a deep pulse rose from beneath the boat, soft, steady, like a heartbeat beneath the water. The monk's eyes widened. Aso smiled. "You felt it." The monk whispered, "What was that?" Aso didn't answer. He cast his net, pulled up 3 fish, perfect, glistening, as if the lake itself had offered them. They paddled back in silence. At the shore, the monk bowed deeply. "I came to learn how to catch," he said, "but you've taught me how to wait." Aso touched his shoulder. "Waiting is only valuable when you're no longer waiting for anything." Back in the present moment, Elias opened his eyes. The man in gray robes looked at him. "Stillness," Elias said softly. "It's not an absence, it's an arrival." The man nodded. "When we stop reaching, life begins to speak." Elias gazed across the lake before them. He no longer sought dragons, but he trusted they were there, sleeping in the stillness, waiting for nothing. And that was everything. Part 7, The River That Remembers. That night, the wind brought the scent of water, not rain, but something older, like a memory the earth had buried beneath layers of silence. Elias lay awake beneath the canopy of stars, listening to the hush of distant currents moving somewhere beyond the edge of hearing. The man in gray robes spoke, not as a teacher now, but as if he too had once wept by a river. "Do you believe time heals all wounds?" he asked quietly. Elias stared into the night. "I used to. Now I wonder if time just buries them." The man nodded slowly. "Some wounds are not meant to be erased, only witnessed until they soften. He turned toward the darkness, as if speaking to it as well. "There's a river far to the south," he said, "not marked on maps, not named in books, but those who carry pain are drawn to it, even if they don't know why." And then he told the story. There once was a woman named Mira who carried sorrow like a stone tied to her chest. No one saw it, but everyone felt it, in the way she paused before answering, the way her hands trembled slightly when she thought no one watched. She had known loss, the kind that lingers, the kind that doesn't ask for permission to stay. One morning, unable to bear the weight, Mira left her village without telling anyone. She walked for days, following only the whisper in her bones, until she came upon a river that shimmered without sun. It flowed in complete silence, no ripple, no splash, just smooth, endless movement. A woman sat by the bank, old, cloaked in reed-colored cloth, her eyes deep as dusk. Without asking Mira's name, she said, "You've come to remember." Mira shook her head. "I came to forget." The woman smiled sadly. "This river does not erase. It reflects." Mira sat beside her. For hours, neither spoke. They simply listened to the silence, as if it were telling them a story. Then the old woman offered her a bowl carved from driftwood. "Place your memory inside," she said, "not to lose it, but to see it clearly." Mira closed her eyes. Into the bowl she poured the image of a child's laughter, and then its absence. The bowl floated onto the river, and instead of drifting away, it hovered, held in place by something unseen. Then it sank, not fast, not sudden, gently, as if returning to a home that had always been waiting. Mira wept, not because the memory was gone, but because it had finally been held. The man fell silent. Elias felt a tightness rise in his chest. A name surfaced, but he did not speak it, just felt it. The man watched him gently. "This world does not ask you to forget," he said, "only to stop carrying everything alone." Elias whispered, "I used to believe healing meant never feeling pain again." "And now?" He looked up. "Now I think healing is learning to feel it without drowning in it." The man's smile was a soft exhale. "Yes, pain is part of the river, but you do not have to live at the bottom." They sat together, not to solve, not to analyze, but to keep company with what still ached. After a long while, Elias asked, "Do you think the river remembers everyone?" The man nodded. "But it never judges. It simply holds, and eventually lets go." Elias looked toward the horizon, where a silver thread of light suggested a river somewhere beyond the hills. Maybe he would go there one day. Maybe not. But something in him felt lighter, as if a bowl had finally touched water and was ready to sink, not as loss, but as release. He whispered to the night, not a prayer, but a thank you. And the river inside him rippled softly, without sound. Part 8. The Sand Garden. By the third morning, Elias had stopped asking what day it was. Time no longer moved in numbers or hours, but in fires lit, stories told, and silences shared. That morning, the man in gray robes was drawing circles in the dust with a stick, slow, deliberate spirals that never touched each other. Elias watched him quietly for some time. "What are you doing?" he asked at last. The man smiled without looking up. "I'm making a garden." Elias raised a brow. "Out of dust?" The man glanced at the wind. "Is there any other kind?" He brushed away a section with the back of his hand and began again. Then he said, "Let me tell you about a man who spent his whole life arranging stones. There was once a monk named Ray who lived on the northern cliffs. He kept no possessions except for a rake and a garden of sand. Each morning at dawn, he would rise and tend to it. He raked perfect patterns, circles around stones, straight lines along the edges, spirals when the mood struck him. Villagers came to watch. They whispered, 'He must be enlightened.' Children imitated his motions with sticks in the dirt. Ray never spoke during his raking. Only afterward would he sit with tea, face serene as the moon on still water. But what no one saw was that Ray was tormented by disorder. He feared chaos the way some fear the dark. As a child, he had lived through a fire that swallowed his home, his family, his sense of safety. Since then, he had craved order like breath. And so, the sand garden became his sanctuary, his mirror, his cage. One day, a storm came early, a summer wind, sharp and wild. Ray had just finished a particularly elegant pattern, a spiral so complex it had taken hours to create. As he stood admiring it, the wind picked up. Dust swirled, leaves scattered, and in a single gust, the entire garden was ruined. Ray fell to his knees, the rake dropping from his hands. His breath grew ragged. His mind screamed, "I've failed. It's broken. I am broken." Then a voice behind him spoke. "You are not the one who creates the pattern," it said. "You are the one who learns to see it." Ray turned. A woman stood there, dressed in traveler's robes, her hair wild, her eyes calm. "This is my garden," he said bitterly. "You don't understand." She walked into the sand, ruined, scattered, then sat down cross-legged in its center. "I do," she said. "I once built towers of glass. They all shattered." Ray watched her. She reached down and drew a single line through the sand, crooked, uneven. Then she smiled. "Now it breathes." For the first time, Ray did not fix the line. He sat beside her, and together they watched the wind continue its work. The man in gray robes looked at the line he had just drawn in the dust. It bent slightly near the edge. He left it that way. Elias, staring at the pattern, felt something stir within him. "I think I've spent most of my life raking sand," he said, "trying to make everything clean, predictable, safe." The man nodded. "And when it wasn't?" Elias looked down. "I blamed the wind." The man smiled softly. "The wind is not your enemy. It is your teacher." Elias watched the breeze lift a curl of ash. "It's strange," he said. "We think beauty is symmetry, but I'm beginning to see it in broken lines." "That's where the life is," the man replied. "In the flaws, in the drift, in the patterns we didn't plan." Elias touched the earth with his fingers. The sand was warm. He whispered, "I used to think peace meant control. Now I think it means being okay when control is gone." The man handed him the stick. "Then rake something and let it be ruined." Elias hesitated, then dragged a long, wavering line through the sand. Moments later, the wind brushed it away. And for once, he did not mourn its passing. He only smiled and drew again. Part 9. The Bell That Was Never Rung. Night settled gently across the field, like a shawl draped by unseen hands. The fire crackled low, its embers pulsing like a quiet heartbeat. Elias sat in silence, staring into the flames, not with urgency, but with the soft gaze of someone who no longer needed answers. only presence. The man in gray robes sat beside him, hands resting on his knees. "Do you know what the rarest sound in the world is?" he asked, voice barely more than a whisper. Elias shook his head slowly. "The sound of something that was never given permission to be heard." He leaned back, eyes tracing the stars. "There's a story about that," he said. "A story of a bell that waited too long." In a monastery deep within the mountains, hidden by snow and stone, there once hung a great bronze bell. It had been cast generations before, poured from melted swords, broken tools, and prayer bowls. The villagers had gathered for days to offer their medals, each piece a fragment of their lives, their struggles, their hopes. When the bell was finally raised into the tower, they believed it would ring only once, at the moment when the world truly needed to wake up. And so they waited. Monks came and went, abbesses passed the tower key in silence. Years turned into decades. The world changed, but the bell was never rung. Some feared its power. Some doubted its purpose. Others simply forgot it was there. Until one day, a young novice named Hannah arrived. She was small, curious, and quiet. She had never seen war, never known famine, but she carried a restlessness she could not name. One dusk, while sweeping the courtyard, she looked up at the tower and asked the elder monk, "What does the bell sound like?" He smiled wearily. "No one knows." She tilted her head. "Then why have we never rung it?" "Because what if it's not the right time? What if it's too loud? What if it breaks?" Hannah stared at the tower long after he walked away. That night she couldn't sleep. The silence felt too heavy, not peaceful, but full of something unsaid. So she rose before dawn and climbed the spiral staircase alone. The bell loomed in the darkness, its surface dusty, its mouth hollow. She placed her hand on the rope. It felt cold and alive. She hesitated. What if no one hears it? What if it changes nothing? What if I am wrong? Then another voice whispered, "What if you were meant to ring it and don't?" She pulled. The sound that followed was not loud, not a crash or cry, but a deep, resonant hum that poured through stone, cloud, and skin. It woke no cities, it moved no mountains, but across the valley, an old man sat up in bed and wept. A child opened her eyes and stopped trembling. A woman stirring rice suddenly remembered a song from her childhood. And the bell was never rung again, because it didn't need to be. The story ended like a note that had yet to fade. Elias felt something shift behind his ribs, a pressure, a silence. He whispered, "I think I have a bell inside me that I've never rung." The man in gray robes looked at him with eyes soft as dusk. "We all do." Elias's voice cracked. "I was afraid it would be too much, or not enough, or worse, unheard." The man stirred the fire with a small stick. "The bell doesn't ring for approval," he said. "It rings because it was made to." They sat in silence. Somewhere far away, a night bird called once, and then the world was still again. Elias looked at his hands. "I used to wait for the perfect time. Now I wonder how many years I lost waiting." The man poured tea that smelled of orange peel and wood smoke. "You don't have to shout," he said. "Just speak. The soul hears in whispers." Elias held the cup. He didn't drink it yet. He simply held it, like a sound waiting to be born. And in the quiet of that night, he whispered, not to be heard, but to become real. I'm ready. The fire cracked softly in reply, and the bell within him hummed, not loudly, but truly. Part 10. The Garden That Grew in Silence. The morning came wrapped in mist, so thick it softened every edge, stone, tree, memory, thought. Elias moved slowly, not because he was tired, but because his body had learned the sweetness of unhurried things. The man in gray robes was tending to a patch of earth by the tree, his fingers gently brushing the soil. Not planting, not harvesting, just touching. Elias knelt beside him. There's nothing here. The man nodded. Exactly. Elias tilted his head. Then what are you doing? Listening, said the man. To what? The man looked at the soil, then at the horizon. To growth you can't yet see. He paused, and his voice dropped like a leaf landing on water. Let me tell you a story about a garden that taught an entire village how to hear, without sound. In a small, dry village where the earth cracked in summer and the rains came late or not at all, there lived an old woman named Suma. She owned a plot of land where nothing grew. Others had tried before, planting rice, barley, even hardy beans. All failed. The villagers called it the Silent Field, a cursed place, a waste of space. But one day, Suma moved in with a single bag of seeds and no explanation. She built no fence, set up no scarecrows. She simply sat and waited. Day after day, she tended the earth, watering gently, clearing weeds, whispering to the wind. Weeks passed, then months. Nothing sprouted. Children laughed. Elders shook their heads. Some grew angry, said she was mocking their labor. But Suma smiled and waited. One evening, a boy named Tavin crept close and asked, "Why do you stay here? It's just dirt." She looked at him kindly. Because not everything that grows makes noise. Tavin didn't understand, but he came back the next day and the next. He helped her water, pull weeds, shade the ground with leaves. He asked no more questions. Then, on the 99th day, something changed. Not a bloom, not even a sprout, but the scent. Soft, sweet, unfamiliar. Tavin leaned close. The soil smelled alive. That night, it rained for the first time in over a year. The next morning, hundreds of tiny shoots pierced the earth, white, green, blushing pink. By the end of the week, the field was a sea of flowers, wild, unfenced, and utterly silent. No one had seen it coming. They asked her, "How did you do it?" Suma said, "I didn't. The earth did, but only after it was finally listened to." And then she left, not because she was done, but because the garden no longer needed her hands, only her trust. The fire crackled in the distance. Elias stared at the patch of ground before him, still bare, but suddenly not empty. He whispered, "I think I've spent most of my life shouting at the ground, begging it to bloom faster." The man in gray robes said, "That is the noise of fear, but love waits." Elias closed his eyes. "I used to think healing was loud, breakthroughs, crying, drama. Now I wonder if it's quieter than I imagined." The man smiled. "The deepest changes make no sound at all, but you feel them, like roots pushing through stone." They sat in stillness. The wind carried the scent of something green, though no flower had yet appeared. And Elias thought, perhaps patience is not about time. Perhaps it is about trust. He whispered, I will wait. Not with desperation, not with timelines, just with presence. And beside him, the earth listened back. Part 11. The Bridge of Maybe. That afternoon, the wind shifted. It didn't howl. It didn't rush. It merely changed direction. The kind of change so subtle you only notice it when you stop walking and feel your robes drift a different way. Elias stood at the edge of a narrow path, watching how it forked into two trails, one that curved gently into the hills, and another that disappeared into a dense, shadowed grove. He had stood at many crossroads in his life, but something about this moment felt familiar, as if every decision he'd ever delayed had returned to ask, "Are you ready now?" The man in gray robes joined him, silently. Together they stared at the place where the trail became two. "This reminds me of something," the man said. "A bridge made entirely of uncertainty." And slowly, with the hush of memory, he began. In a region of mountains where clouds walked the ground like ghosts, there was said to be a bridge. It connected no towns, it led from no door, but it always appeared to those who didn't know which way to go. Some said the bridge was cursed, others claimed it tested the soul, but no one denied this. You could only see it when you said the word maybe. A woman named June stood at the foot of it. She was neither young nor old, just at that stage of life when the path behind is crowded and the one ahead is blurred. She had spent her life choosing carefully: jobs, partners, houses, beliefs. She studied every option, analyzed every risk, and now, at the most important choice of all, she stood frozen. To one side, the life she had built. To the other, something unknown, yet quietly calling. She whispered, "Maybe I'm not ready." And the bridge appeared. It was not made of stone or wood, but of mist, shifting, unsure, yet firm beneath the feet of those who stepped forward. A sign hung at the entrance. "You will not know until you cross." Jun trembled. What if it collapses? What if it leads nowhere? What if I regret it? A voice echoed from the mist, not loud, not commanding, just honest. Then maybe you will become someone new. Jun hesitated. Then she took one step. The bridge held, not because it was strong, but because she no longer needed certainty to move. She crossed slowly, with tears, with doubt, but also with the quiet thrill of courage. And on the other side, there was no revelation, no prize, just a small garden and a bench and a place to rest. She sat down, looked back, and realized something simple but true. The path itself had changed her, not what was waiting at the end. The man finished the story and gazed at the two trails. Elias didn't speak for a long time. Then he whispered, "I think I've spent most of my life fearing the wrong turn." The man replied, "There are no wrong turns, only roads that shape you in different ways." Elias looked toward the darker path. "It's never about what's at the end, is it?" The man shook his head. "It's about whether you were alive while walking it." A bird flew overhead, its wings slicing the air in absolute trust. Elias took a step toward the unknown trail, not because he was sure, but because maybe was no longer frightening. It had become sacred. Part 12. The empty teacup. By twilight, the fire was warm again, but Elias no longer sat close to it for comfort. He sat for presence. The man in gray robes had just finished boiling a small pot of tea, the kind that smelled of roasted rice and memory. He poured it slowly, his movements like poetry too quiet to write. When he offered the cup to Elias, he did not speak, and Elias, out of instinct, took the cup, then stopped. It was already full. Tea spilled over the rim onto his fingers. He flinched, not from pain, but from the realization. He looked up. The man was watching. "I poured more than you could hold," the man said softly. Elias blinked and nodded. The man smiled, then poured the rest of the tea into the earth and began his story. There once was a scholar who had studied every sacred text known in his land. He had shelves of scrolls, books bound in silk, commentaries thicker than stone. He knew the names of all the Buddhas, the causes of suffering, the structures of the mind. People called him Master of Understanding, and he believed it. But one day, he heard of a hermit who lived deep in the mountain forest, a man said to possess a wisdom so pure, even the birds sang differently around him. The scholar, intrigued but skeptical, set out with a list of questions. He prepared arguments. He rehearsed insights. When he arrived, the hermit offered him tea. As they sat, the scholar began to speak about doctrines and theories and systems of thought. The hermit listened, poured the tea, listened more, and continued pouring. The scholar noticed the cup filling, then reaching the rim. Still the hermit poured. Tea spilled across the table, soaked the floor, burned the edge of the scholar's scrolls. "Stop!" he cried. "It's full!" The hermit paused and smiled. "So is your mind." The scholar stared, breath caught. "If I pour more," said the hermit, "it spills. If you want to receive, you must first become empty." The scholar set his cup down, and in the silence that followed, his questions dissolved. Not because they were answered, but because they were no longer barriers. They had become space. Elias was quiet for a long time. The cup in his hands still trembled slightly, though the tea had cooled. "I used to think wisdom meant knowing," he said. "Now I wonder if it means forgetting." The man nodded. "Not forgetting the truth, but forgetting your certainty." Elias closed his eyes. He remembered how tightly he had once clung to his beliefs, about people, about the world, about himself. How each thought had become a brick, and how proud he had been of the walls. "I spent so long trying to prove I was right," he whispered. "But I never asked if being right was what I really needed." The man reached for the pot again, held it poised above Elias's cup. "Shall I pour?" Elias smiled, then turned his cup over, letting the last few drops fall into the earth. "Now you may." The man poured. The tea didn't spill, and for the first time, Elias drank, not to fill, but to receive. Part 13. The Lantern in the Fog. The fog rolled in after midnight, thick, soundless, complete. Even the fire seemed to shrink in its presence, its glow wrapped in layers of mist like a secret, unsure whether to be told. Elias stirred from a shallow sleep. The world felt softer, but also stranger. Shapes had lost their edges. Time had lost its clock. He sat up, disoriented. The man in gray robes was already awake, kneeling beside a small oil lantern he had lit, its tiny flame flickering inside a bowl of glass. "Fog," Elias said quietly. "It makes everything uncertain." The man nodded. "It does, and it also teaches us the difference between seeing and trusting." He looked into the glow of the lantern and added, "Would you like to hear a story about a woman who walked through fog for 3 days and only then found her way?" Elias nodded, and the man began. There was once a woman named Nara, who lived in a city where the sky was always clear. The people prided themselves on direction: compasses, maps, stars carved into the streets. You always knew where you were, and more importantly, where you were going. But Nara was different. She didn't feel at home in clarity. She asked questions others didn't like. What if I don't know what I want yet? What if the path I'm on isn't mine? Most smiled politely. Some rolled their eyes. A few turned away. So one morning, with no plan but a pull in her chest, she left the city. She took only a lantern, a gift from her grandmother, who had once said, "You won't always know the way, but light enough to see one step is sometimes all you need." By midday, a fog rose from the ground, thick as milk, cool as absence. She could not see more than a few feet ahead. She considered turning back, but something within whispered, "Forward." So she walked, each step slow, each sound muffled, each tree a shadow, each stone a question. After one day, she grew afraid. After two, she grew quiet. After three, she grew still, not with despair, but with surrender, not of hope, but of the need to see the destination. And that night, as she sat with her lantern resting on her knees, a clearing opened, not in the fog, but in her mind. She realized she no longer needed to know where the path led, only that it kept unfolding beneath her feet as long as she walked with care. And in that moment, the fog lifted, not because she had found the way, but because she had found peace within not knowing. The man in gray robes paused. The fog thickened around them, as if honoring the story. Elias whispered, "I've lived most of my life waiting for the fog to clear before I moved, but it never does." The man smiled gently. "No, because life is not the absence of uncertainty. It is the courage to move inside it." Elias stared into the small lantern between them. The flame wavered, but it did not go out. "I always thought faith meant believing in something I couldn't see," he said. "But maybe it means walking without needing to see at all." The man nodded. "To trust that the next step exists, even when you cannot name it." They sat in the fog, neither afraid, neither lost, just present, in a world that was not clear, but was somehow enough. Elias closed his eyes, and with the soft weight of the mist resting on his shoulders, he whispered into the silence, "I will keep walking." And somewhere within him, a lantern flickered. Part 14. The House That Waited. The fog lifted by morning, but Elias carried its softness with him. It lingered not in his sight, but in his breath, in the way he moved through the world, gently, as if not everything needed to be solved right away. He sat near the tree with the crooked spine, hands resting in his lap, eyes closed. Not meditating, not thinking, just being. The man in gray robes arrived without sound. He sat beside Elias, then placed something between them, a stone, old, weathered, smooth, and carved with the shape of a doorway. Elias opened his eyes. "What is this?" The man smiled. "A key to a place you may have forgotten you ever lived." And he began. There once was a man named Coan who wandered for so long he forgot he had ever belonged anywhere.
He traveled across valleys, rivers, cities where no one knew his name. He made stories for himself: merchant, scribe, thief, monk. Each year he rewrote the tale, each season a new role. But in truth, he was always searching for something, though he did not know what. One autumn evening, as the sky burned orange and the leaves clung to the trees like final wishes, Koan came across a road he had never meant to walk.
It was narrow, lined with bent cypress trees, and at its end stood a house, small, stone, silent. He paused. Something about the curve of the roof, the color of the wood, the way the wind passed through the gate, it stirred something in him, something so old it felt like childhood. He stepped closer. The door was unlocked. Inside, dust, soft light, an empty chair, a faded rug, and on the table, a bowl of river stones, each one warm to the touch. He wandered from room to room. No memories came, only the sense that they had once lived there, that this was not a discovery, but a return. In the smallest room, he found a mirror, cracked, not broken, still enough to hold a reflection. He looked into it and whispered, "Where have I been all this time?" The silence replied, "Far away, but never gone." He wept, not for what he had missed, but for what had waited. For this house had not called to him. It had only opened when he was ready to remember. When the story ended, Elias sat very still. "I've spent so much time running towards something," he said, "but now I wonder if I've been circling something that was always waiting." The man in gray robes looked at him gently. "Not everything you left behind was lost. Some things were patient." Elias nodded slowly. "I don't know if I remember the house in the story, but I feel like I've longed for it all my life." The man placed the stone with the carved doorway into Elias's hands. "You don't have to go back," he said. "You only need to know it's still there, and that you are still welcome." They sat in silence, the kind that feels like walls breathing, and Elias understood. Home is not always a place. Sometimes it is the knowing that we can stop searching, even if for a while. He held the stone close to his chest, not as a possession, but as a remembrance. And something in him settled, like a door long closed, finally opening, not to let something in, but to let something out. Part 15. The Thread Beneath the Ashes. The evening sky was painted in shades of smoke and rose, as if memory itself had begun to dissolve into the horizon. Elias sat with the fire before him, its glow steady but low, like the heartbeat of something still alive beneath what had cooled. The man in gray robes was silent for a long time. Then, without turning, he asked, "Do you believe something broken can still be connected?" Elias hesitated. "Sometimes, other times, it feels too late." The man nodded slowly. "Then perhaps you're ready for this story. It's not about repair, it's about what never truly came apart." And he began. Long ago, in a mountain village where winters came early and left late, there were two brothers, Rin and Toma. They were born minutes apart, grew together like branches from the same trunk. They laughed in rhythm, argued like thunder, and protected each other without needing words. But one year, in the coldest season of their lives, they fought. Not a small quarrel, a fracture. Over land, over pride, over something neither could remember clearly years later. Toma left. He crossed the valley and built a home from stone. He raised children, he tended his field, but he never returned. And Rin stayed. He raked the ashes of their last winter's fire, collected the unburned pieces of wood, and kept them stacked in the corner of the hearth. Just in case, he would mutter. Time passed. Their hair grayed. Letters stopped. But Rin still swept the ashes every winter and placed a bowl beside the hearth, always 2 cups of tea. Then one spring, after the snow had melted and the river began to murmur again, a fire broke out in Toma's village. His home burned. Nothing was saved. He wandered, lost and dazed, carrying only the clothes he wore and a single charred stone from the base of his hearth. It had been cracked in the fire, blackened, but still warm. He walked until he found himself on the edge of the village he once left. He stood there for hours, unsure. But the smoke from Rin's chimney curled gently, as if it had been waiting. When he entered, Rin was sitting by the hearth, raking the ashes with an old stick. Without a word, Toma sat beside him. Rin didn't speak. He only reached into the ashes, pulled something out. A length of red thread. Once used to tie wood bundles, it had survived the years somehow, not whole, but not snapped. He held one end, offered the other. Toma took it. And in that moment, the space between them ceased to be distance. It became history, memory, and forgiveness without need for apology. The thread wasn't fixed. It had simply never been broken. When the story ended, Elias didn't speak. Instead, he reached toward the fire and gently stirred the ash with a twig. A small coal flared orange beneath the gray. I had a brother, he said. We haven't spoken in 20 years. The man looked at him, eyes soft. And is the thread still there? Elias swallowed. I don't know. The man replied, Then you must sit by the ashes a while longer. Sometimes the thread is waiting for your hands to remember how to find it. They sat together, watching the coal glow, not bright, but steady. Elias whispered, I thought some connections were gone forever. The man smiled gently. Some are, but others, they're just buried, and they wait for warmth. Elias nodded, and with reverence placed a second cup of tea beside the fire, not for who would come, but for the part of him that still believed someone might. Part 16. The Cloud That Didn't Stay. The sky that day was restless. Clouds drifted like thoughts across a tired mind, gathering, parting, forming shapes that meant everything for a moment, and then nothing. Elias sat with his chin in his hands, watching them. Why do they never stay? He asked. The man in gray robes didn't answer right away. He too was watching the clouds, not to name them, but to witness their passing. Finally, he said, Because their nature is movement, and so is ours. Elias whispered, I miss people who've left. Some walked away, some were taken. The man nodded slowly. There is a story, he said, about a girl who tried to keep a cloud forever. Would you like to hear it? Elias said yes, and the man began. In a quiet valley where the wind never rushed, a girl named Aya lived with her grandmother, who told her stories each night about rivers that never repeated a bend, trees that shed leaves to make room for new ones, and clouds that only stayed as long as they were needed. Aya loved the last story most, because she hated goodbyes. One summer, when the sky was clearest,
A single cloud appeared above her village. It was perfect, round, soft, glowing like milk warmed by sunlight. Aya saw it as her own. She named it Luma, waved to it each morning, told it stories at night. "Don't leave," she whispered to it, as if her breath could anchor the sky. And for a while, the cloud remained. But as autumn crept in, the winds shifted. The sky grew deeper, and the cloud began to drift. Aya begged it to stay. She cried. She sang lullabies to the sky. But Luma floated higher, further, until one day it was gone. Aya fell into silence. She refused to look at the sky. She stopped telling stories. Her grandmother, old and tender-eyed, took her hand. "Why are you sad?" she asked. "Because the thing I loved most didn't stay." The grandmother nodded. "Ah, then you loved it well." "But it left." "Everything does," she said. "The question is not whether they stay. It's whether we can keep our hearts open when they go." Aya frowned. "How?" Her grandmother reached into her satchel and pulled out a smooth stone. Inside it was carved the outline of a cloud. "This is not to hold the cloud," she said. "It is to remind you that it once shared your sky." Aya took the stone, held it close. That night, she looked up. The sky was empty, but her heart was not. And from that moment on, she told her stories to the stars, not to keep them near, but to thank them for passing through. The fire crackled, and Elias's breath softened. "I tried to hold on to people," he said, "to moments, to love, as if clenching harder would make them stay." The man stirred the tea with a branch. "And did they?" Elias shook his head. "No, they left anyway. And I was left with nothing but fists full of air." The man looked toward the sky. "Open hands catch rain. Closed ones only squeeze shadows." They sat in silence. Then Elias reached into the pocket of his robe and pulled out a small pebble. He traced it with his thumb. It had no name, but it held something he had once loved, something that had drifted. "I think," Elias said, "it's time to stop asking why they left." The man smiled gently. "And start remembering how beautifully they once arrived." The sky above them was empty again, but this time neither man looked away. They simply breathed and let the sky be what it was, open, vast, unpromising, and still full of quiet gifts. Part 17. The Sparrow Who Forgot to Fly. The sun was slow to rise that morning, as if unsure whether the world was ready for its light. Elias sat near the tree, a blanket wrapped around his shoulders, watching a small bird hopping in the grass. Its wings fluttered, but it never lifted off the ground. It pecked, it paused, it waited, but it did not fly. He turned to the man in gray robes. "Why do some of us forget how to do the very thing we were born to do?" The man looked at the bird, then at Elias. "Because somewhere along the way, someone told us we couldn't." He poured a small cup of warm water, handed it to Elias, and said softly, "Let me tell you about a sparrow who once believed she was broken." In a dense grove on the edge of a windy cliff, there lived a sparrow named Luma. She had hatched later than the others. Her wings were smaller, her feathers slower to grow. The others teased her, not cruelly, but often enough that her silence grew thicker than her wings. When the time came for the fledglings to fly, they lined the edge of the nest, chests puffed, eyes bright.
One by one they leapt, one by one they soared. Luma stayed behind. She told herself, "I'm just not ready." But even when her wings had grown, even when the winds were kind, she still did not try. Seasons passed, birds came and went, nests were built and abandoned. The grove changed, but Luma remained. She hopped from branch to branch, gathered berries, sang softly to herself. She lived quietly, safely, but never fully. One day, a great storm broke over the cliff. Lightning cracked a tree nearby. Winds howled through the grove. Luma huddled in a hollow trunk, heart racing. When the storm passed, the forest was quiet. Too quiet. Something was wrong. She hopped out. In the grass lay a fledgling, a stranger, newly hatched, thrown from its nest in the wind. It chirped weakly, tiny wings splayed, eyes wild with fear. Without thinking, Luma hopped forward. She lifted the fledgling gently onto her back and began to climb, branch by branch, trunk by trunk, higher and higher. But the nest was gone, blown away. She looked down. The earth was far below. The wind still moved. And something within her stirred. Not fear, but memory. She stepped to the edge of the branch, closed her eyes, and let go. At first she fell, but then her wings caught the wind. Not perfectly, not high, but enough. She glided, she rose, she flew. Not because she believed she could, but because someone else needed her to try. When she landed, she wept, not from pain, but from the joy of remembering what had never been truly lost. And from that day, she sang louder, not to prove anything, only to remind herself that the sky had always been hers. When the story ended, Elias was quiet. The small bird still pecked in the grass nearby. "I used to write songs," he said softly, "music that made people cry. Then one day, someone told me it wasn't very good, and I stopped." The man in gray robes nodded. "And did their voice become your own?" "Yes." The man reached for a leaf that had fallen beside him. He let it rest in his palm, then lifted it. The wind caught it, spinning it gently through the air until it landed again a few feet away. "Even the smallest thing remembers how to fall," he said, "and sometimes how to fly." Elias whispered, "I want to sing again, not for praise, not for success, just to feel the music return." The man smiled. "Then your wings are already stirring." They sat quietly, as the bird in the grass suddenly fluttered up, just an inch, then again, higher. And Elias, he closed his eyes and hummed a tune he had once written in another life that was still his. Part 18, The Door Without a Handle. That evening, the wind died down completely, and the air became so still that even the birds chose to remain silent. Elias sat beside the old crooked tree, his back pressed to the bark, eyes gazing out toward a field washed in quiet amber light. He looked at the man in gray robes and asked, "Why do some parts of me stay closed, even when I think I'm ready to open?" The man didn't answer right away. Instead, he picked up a small, smooth stone and rubbed its surface with his thumb. Then he said, "Some doors are not meant to be opened by force. Some wait for something softer." He placed the stone between them, and his voice softened further. "There is a story about a door that no one could open. Would you like to hear it?" Elias nodded, and so the man began. In a distant village hidden among fog-draped hills, there stood a small stone cottage with a single wooden door. It was plain, no carvings, no locks, no hinges exposed, and no handle. The people called it the Quiet House. No one knew who had built it. No one had ever seen anyone go in or out. But every morning, fresh flowers appeared on the windowsill, and every night, a warm light glowed behind the shutters. Curious travelers tried to open the door. They knocked, they shouted, they pulled and pushed and whispered riddles. Nothing worked. Some gave up quickly. Some stayed for days. One man camped there for 3 weeks, meditating, chanting, fasting. The door remained shut. Then, one autumn morning, a girl no older than 10 wandered into the village. She had no name that anyone remembered, and a quiet way about her, like someone who listened even to stones. She walked to the door, sat down in front of it, and said nothing. Each day she came, not to open the door, not to try, just to sit. Sometimes humming softly, sometimes crying, sometimes watching clouds move across the sky. The villagers grew curious, but she ignored their questions. Then, on the 21st day, just before dusk, the door creaked open. No one had touched it. No wind had stirred. It simply opened. The girl stood, stepped inside, and disappeared. The villagers rushed forward, but when they reached the threshold, the door was already shut once more. No light, no sound, no handle. They never saw the girl again. But each morning after that, 2 flowers appeared on the windowsill, and the shutters glowed warmer than before. When the story ended, Elias stared at the ground, tracing invisible shapes with his finger. "I've tried everything," he said quietly. "Therapy, books, rituals, retreat after retreat, but there are parts of me that still won't open." The man in gray robes looked at him with deep calm. "Then stop trying." Elias frowned. "I don't understand." "Because understanding is another form of knocking," the man replied. "And some doors don't open to cleverness, they open to presence." He paused. "What if the locked parts of you are not waiting to be solved, but simply to be sat beside?" Elias swallowed. A memory stirred, of times he had pushed himself to change, only to end up more tired, more lost. "I've sat beside other people's pain," he said, "but not my own." The man smiled gently. "Then perhaps your door is waiting for your company, not your effort." They sat in silence, not to fix, not to search, only to be there, together. And somewhere deep inside Elias, he heard the faintest click. Not loud, not complete, but real. A door within, not opened, but listening. Part 19. The Cup That Caught the Rain. The clouds gathered slowly, as if the sky was remembering how to weep. Elias sat beneath the old tree, his cup resting beside him, empty. The man in gray robes sat nearby, eyes closed, face lifted slightly, as if listening not with his ears, but with his skin. A soft wind passed. Then, the first drop. It tapped the earth. Then another. Soon, the quiet was filled with the gentle rhythm of rain. Not heavy, but steady, like a whisper meant only for those who had stopped trying to speak. Elias held his cup out toward the sky, not to drink, but to catch. The man opened his eyes, smiled. "Do you know the story of the cup that waited for years to be filled?" Elias shook his head, and the man began. "There was once a potter named Nema who made cups for a living. Not ornate ones, not for nobles or ceremonies, just simple clay cups, warm in the hand, steady at the base, made for holding ordinary things. She sold them in the village square, where the farmers came for bread and tea, where laughter echoed without effort. One day, she made a cup unlike any other. It wasn't more beautiful, or larger, or painted with gold. But something about it made her pause. She didn't sell it, didn't use it. She simply placed it by the window, where sunlight touched it in the mornings and moonlight kissed it at night. Seasons passed. Visitors came and went. No one touched the cup. Some asked why it sat empty. "It's waiting," Nima would say. For what? She only smiled. Years rolled by. The cup remained. Until one summer evening, a great drought came. The wells dried, the rivers thinned. The villagers prayed for rain, none came. But still the cup waited. Then one morning, after a long silence, the sky opened. Rain fell, soft at first, then steady, and the cup, having waited all those years, caught the very first drop. Others rushed with buckets, pans, hands cupped in desperation. But Nima just sat beside her little cup, watching it slowly fill. Later, someone asked, "Why didn't you collect more?" She held the cup up. "This is enough." They frowned. "It's only a mouthful." She looked at the water inside, clear, glistening, alive.
Sometimes, she said, what matters is not how much you catch, but how long you were willing to wait with an open heart. When the story ended, Elias watched as rain gathered slowly in his cup. Not quickly, not urgently, but gently. He whispered, "I used to chase more money, more meaning, more growth." The man in gray robes looked at the sky. And did it satisfy? Elias shook his head. No, because even when I got what I wanted, I was already reaching for the next. The man placed a hand over his own chest. The deepest fullness doesn't come from pouring, it comes from catching. Elias looked into his cup. Only a thin layer of water so far, but somehow it felt sacred. "I think," he said, "that the moments I used to rush past, the small ones, were always trying to feed me." The man nodded. Rain does not ask to be noticed. It only asks not to be resisted. They sat in silence, letting the drops fall, letting the cups fill at their own pace. And Elias understood. He had been thirsty for years, but not for oceans, just for one clean sip from something real. Part 20. The Music Beneath the Silence. That night, no birds sang, no wind stirred. Even the fire was a hush, its flames curling like breath in meditation. Elias sat with his hands folded in his lap, gazing into the stillness, and for the first time, he didn't wish to fill it. He had begun to trust the silence, not as absence, but as presence in its rawest form. The man in gray robes sat nearby, gently tapping a wooden bowl with a dry reed. It made no sound. Still, he smiled, as if music had bloomed from the quiet. Elias tilted his head. "Why are you tapping if there's no sound?" The man looked up, eyes warm. "Because sometimes the most important things are heard only when nothing is playing." He placed the reed down. "There's a story I once heard, not told with words, but with silence. Would you like to feel it?" Elias nodded, and so the man began. In a distant monastery, built halfway between the ocean and the sky, there lived a monk named Ren. Ren was not the most disciplined. He often arrived late to morning chants, sometimes forgot to refill the water basin, and once fell asleep during walking meditation. But he had one gift no one else shared. He could hear things others missed. The breath of moss, the blink of stars, the way the moon hummed when no one looked at it directly. He never spoke of these things, he only listened. One day, a renowned master visited the monastery. He was famous for composing sacred music, flute, bell, and drum compositions said to calm even the most restless spirit. The abbot arranged a performance that evening. The monks prepared for days. Ren helped arrange the cushions, swept the floors, lit the incense. But when the time came for the music to begin, the master simply sat. No instruments, no words, just stillness. Minutes passed, then more, then many. Some monks fidgeted, others grew annoyed. A few dozed off. Ren, however, leaned in. He could hear it. The music behind the silence, the melody of still breath, the rhythm of blinking, the chord between two heartbeats. When it ended, if it could be said to end, the master stood, bowed, and left. The monks were confused, some disappointed.
Ren said nothing, but that night he walked into the woods and listened to the trees, and for the first time they sang back. The story dissolved into the space between breaths. Elias whispered, "I've filled so much of my life with noise." The man looked at him gently. "To distract from the song you feared you wouldn't like?" Elias swallowed. "Yes." He thought of the music he used to play, loud, proud, brilliant, always composed for others, always measured in applause. Now, in the stillness, he heard a different song, one that pulsed beneath his ribs, one that didn't rise or fall, but simply was. "I think," Elias said, "that I'm finally ready to hear what I've never dared to sit still for." The man picked up the reed again, tapped the bowl. It sang this time, a single clear tone, not loud, not long, but real. They listened as it faded, then listened even after it had gone. And in that space, a music deeper than sound continued to play. Part 21. The Candle That Watched the Dawn. The wind that night was soft but steady, pressing gently against the edges of the fire, as if reminding it to stay awake just a little longer. Elias sat wrapped in his robe, his eyes heavy, but his heart alert, not with worry, but with presence. Beside him, the man in gray robes lit a small beeswax candle and placed it carefully on a smooth, flat stone. Its flame flickered in the darkness, steady but small. Elias watched it for a long time. "It doesn't seem to do much," he said. The man looked at the candle. "No, but it hasn't gone out." He paused, then added, "Would you like to hear the story of a candle who waited for a dawn that never came?" Elias nodded slowly, and the man began. In a distant temple at the top of a mountain, there lived a candle. It had never been lit. Its wick remained white, its wax unblemished. The monks said it was a sacred object, meant only to be burned on the day the world needed it most. They placed it in the highest room of the tower. Each day they passed by it. Each year they dusted around it, but they never lit it. Time passed. Seasons circled. The world changed. The monks grew old. Some died, some left, but the candle remained. One winter, a terrible storm swept across the mountains. Snow blocked the paths. Food ran low. The monastery grew cold. Only one monk remained, old, frail, nearly blind. And one night, the wind howled so loud it seemed to come from within the walls themselves. The monk, trembling from cold and loneliness,
climbed the stairs to the tower. He stood before the candle, whispered, "I don't know if this is the moment you were made for, but I don't want to die in the dark." He struck a match, lit the wick. The candle bloomed to life. Its flame was not grand, not holy, just warm. It did not save the world, it did not bring visions, but it lit the room. The monk sat beside it. He breathed. He sang an old song to no one. He wept, not from sorrow, but from the softness of being seen, even by something small. He lived through the night, and by morning he was gone. But the candle, half burned and flickering, had done its work. It had not waited for the perfect moment. It had simply given what it could when someone needed it most. When the story ended, Elias stared into the flame before them. "It wasn't lit for greatness," he said softly. "It was lit for kindness." The man nodded. "Sometimes we wait our whole lives for a big moment, some grand calling, some perfect role. But most of the time, what the world needs is a quiet flame willing to stay." Elias leaned forward slightly, his voice barely audible. "I think I've been afraid that what I offer is too small." The man smiled gently. "And yet, here you are, still listening, still waking each day, still sitting beside another soul." He pointed to the candle. "You are not the sun, but you are the light that made this hour bearable." Elias closed his eyes and let the warmth of the flame brush his face. He no longer needed to prove his purpose. He only needed to remain until the darkness began to fade. And even then, perhaps a little longer. Part 22, The Path That Circled Back. That morning, the air was crisp with the kind of clarity that comes after a long stretch of silence. Not loud, not bright, but awake. Elias stood at the edge of the path that had carried him this far. His feet no longer ached. His breath no longer rushed. He had stopped asking where he was going. Instead, he now listened for where the path was gently pointing. The man in gray robes stood beside him, hands folded in front of him, eyes fixed on the winding trail ahead. "It feels endless," Elias said. The man nodded. "And sometimes it is." "But not because it doesn't arrive, only because it arrives somewhere you didn't expect." He looked out toward the trees, where light danced in loose threads between the leaves. "There's a story," he said, "about a man who walked around the world, only to find what he needed had always been with him." And so he began. There was once a traveler named Danu who carried a map he had drawn by hand. A web of trails, dotted cities, rivers bent like questions, all leading away from a small house marked with a single circle. That house had been his, the place where he was born, the place he had longed to escape. "It is too small," he once said, "too quiet, too familiar." So he left. He walked across deserts that whispered to him in riddles, slept beneath stars that knew no names. He listened to languages he could not speak, and stood before mountains that made him forget his own voice. With every step, he told himself he was becoming more free, more real. He collected artifacts, a smooth shell from the western shore, a feather from a firebird he never saw, a pouch of red earth that never lost its warmth. And yet, he was never still. Decades passed. His beard grew white. His hands curled with time. His map became worn, creased by years and rains and longing. Then, one evening, with no reason he could name, he turned east, not out of purpose, but from a pull, gentle, unspoken.
The roads narrowed. The languages became familiar again. The trees bent the way he remembered. The smell of the soil grew sweeter. And finally, he stood before a house. Old, faded, but still there. His house. He stepped onto the porch, not with triumph, but with reverence. Inside, nothing had waited, and yet everything had. He sat by the hearth, lit a small fire, and laid down his bag of treasures. As the flames danced, he realized he had brought the world home. But more than that, he had brought himself. Not the boy who left, not the man who wandered, but the one who could finally sit still and see the beauty of what had once felt too small. The story settled like dew upon the grass. Elias stood quietly, his hands clasped behind his back. "I left everything," he said. "Family, familiarity, all of it, to find meaning." The man looked at him. "And have you found it?" Elias closed his eyes. "I think I found pieces, but I don't know if I ever looked back long enough to see what I'd left." The man smiled gently. "Some journeys don't lead you forward. They lead you inward, and inward often means home." Elias knelt, ran his fingers through the soil of the path, felt the softness of the earth, the breath of roots beneath. "I thought returning meant failure," he whispered. "But maybe returning is the beginning I never gave myself." The man placed a hand on his shoulder. "Even the sun circles back, and no one calls it lost." They sat together at the edge of the trail, not to decide where to go next, but to honor the miracle of having come this far. And in the stillness, Elias understood. You don't always need new roads. Sometimes you only need new eyes for the road you once called ordinary. Part 23. The Stone That Waited to Be Seen. The morning passed without hurry. Birdsong returned, but softly, as if even the sparrows knew that too much noise might startle the silence now living inside Elias. He sat beneath the tree, eyes lowered to the ground, watching ants carry a single crumb across a path as wide to them as a river. The man in gray robes crouched nearby, turning a flat, speckled stone over in his hand. After a while, he placed it down with care, as if it were not just a stone, but a memory. Elias looked at it. "What do you see?" the man asked. Elias leaned closer. "Just a rock." The man nodded. "Yes, that's what everyone said for 100 years." Elias raised his eyes. "There's a story?" The man smiled and began. In a quiet garden beside a monastery, there lay a single stone, flat, dull gray, often stepped over, sometimes kicked by children too young to know better. The monks ignored it. Visitors never noticed it. Even the gardener once considered removing it to make space for something more beautiful. But the stone remained. Seasons changed. Leaves blanketed it in autumn. Snow hid it in winter. The sun warmed its surface in summer. But no one lingered. Until one morning, a boy named Tenzin arrived at the monastery. He was not a student, not yet, only a visitor, sent to stay for a few weeks to learn stillness. He was quiet by nature, observant, more curious about shadows than statues. Each day he passed the stone, and unlike the others, he noticed it, not because it was grand, but because it felt patient. He began to sit beside it, at first just for rest, then out of habit, then out of something he couldn't name. He began speaking to it, not expecting answers, but finding comfort in being heard. I'm not sure what I'm supposed to become, he'd say. Or, I think I'm too slow to matter. Or sometimes, nothing at all. Just silence and the steady presence of the stone. One afternoon, curious, he brought a brush and water and gently cleaned the surface. As the dirt lifted, markings appeared, faint lines carved by careful hands. He scrubbed more, revealed an old etching, a lotus in bloom. Beneath it, two characters, Yugen, deep grace unseen. The monks gathered. They had passed the stone for decades. None had known. Some wept, some bowed, all marveled. But the boy, he just smiled. He had seen it long before he had read it. The story settled over the garden like morning dew. Elias stared at the stone in front of him. It hadn't changed, but somehow it glowed. I've been the stone, he whispered, all my life, trying to be noticed, waiting to be seen. The man in gray robes looked at him gently. And were you? Elias hesitated. Sometimes, but often only when I made noise. The man nodded. Some people shine, others hold. Both are needed. But the stone's gift is not in being seen, it's in never leaving. Elias looked down. I think I judged myself for being quiet. And yet, said the man, your quiet may be what kept someone else from falling. They sat together, and Elias, for once, didn't need to say more. He let the stone speak for him. Let its stillness translate everything he couldn't explain. And somewhere deep inside, he finally understood. To be solid, to be silent, to be steady, is also to be sacred. Part 24. The Leaf That Let Go. The wind that evening came in gentle waves, like a lullaby meant only for trees. Elias sat beneath a canopy of golden branches, watching leaves fall, one by one, each with its own rhythm, its own farewell. He caught one in his hand, held it, studied its fading veins, its edges curled like the smile of something that knew how to say goodbye. I used to fear letting go, he said quietly. The man in gray robes sat beside him, watching the same tree. He nodded. Many do. They mistake release for loss, but there is a difference. He picked up a leaf that had just landed beside him. This one fell, he said, not because it was weak, but because it was ready. He turned it in his hand and added, there's a story I once heard from a tree older than time. And then, as if the air itself held its breath, he began. There was once a leaf named Sori, who lived high on the oldest branch of the tallest tree in the forest. From her perch, she saw everything. Sunrises that painted the world in gold, storms that danced with thunder, birds in flight, seeds in bloom. She loved her branch. She loved the wind. She even loved the silence between seasons. But one autumn, the tree whispered, "It's almost time." Sori trembled. "I don't want to fall," she said. "I want to stay. I'm not finished." The tree was quiet, then replied, "Falling is not ending. It is continuing, differently." But Sori clenched tighter. Day by day, the other leaves let go. One floated down like a feather. Another twirled in laughter. A few wept, but all accepted, except Sori. She held on through frost, through wind, through the first snow. And the tree, loving her no less, let her choose. Then, one night, under a pale moon, Sori heard a sound, not from outside, but within, a tiny crack, not of breaking, but of opening. She looked inward and saw something she had never noticed, a memory of light, of movement, of trust. And with no ceremony, no regret, she let go. She didn't fall, she floated, spinning slowly, like a thought remembered only when the world grows quiet. When she landed, the earth sighed, and in time, she became soil. And in that soil, a seed awakened. Not her, not exactly, but something made possible because she had finally released. When the story ended, Elias still held the leaf in his hand. He didn't crush it, didn't drop it. He simply placed it on the ground beside him with tenderness. I held on too long, he said softly. To people, to expectations, to who I thought I had to be. The man in gray robes looked at him. And now? Elias looked up into the branches, now half bare. I think I'm ready to trust the fall. The man nodded. Letting go is not giving up, it's making room. They sat as more leaves drifted down, each one a lesson written without ink. And Elias whispered, to fall with grace is also to rise again in a form the wind already understands. And the tree above him, now lighter, now free, let another leaf go, not in sorrow, but in love. Part 25, The Silence After the Bell. The bell rang at dusk, not loudly, not in haste, but in a tone that seemed to bow to the moment instead of declaring it. Elias sat cross-legged beneath the old tree. His hands rested in his lap, his eyes gently closed. Beside him, the man in gray robes rang the bell once more, a soft echo that traveled farther than any word ever could. And then, nothing. Not silence in the absence of sound, but silence that had presence. Elias breathed in, breathed out, but no longer searched for anything between those breaths. After a while, he whispered, "What comes after all the stories?" The man turned slightly toward him, his voice quieter than the breeze. "There's a story about that too," he said, "but it has no beginning, no middle, no end." He smiled. "Still want to hear it?" Elias nodded, and the man began the final tale. There was once a temple so high in the mountains that no roads led to it, only silence. In this temple lived a monk who had forgotten his name, not out of illness, but out of freedom. Each day he swept the same path, boiled the same tea, watched the same clouds. Visitors sometimes found him, pilgrims, seekers, the broken-hearted, each asking questions. What is the nature of truth? Why do we suffer? How can I be free? The monk would always smile, listen carefully, and then ring a small bell, once, clear, precise. He would then bow and walk away. Some grew frustrated, others confused, a few even wept, but a rare few stayed. They swept beside him, boiled water, watched clouds, and in time they forgot their questions too. One day, a boy asked him, "Why the bell?" The monk paused, held the bell up to the light. Its shape was worn, but perfect. He said, "The bell is the question. The silence after is the answer." Then he rang it again, and let the silence widen like a field where all things grow without being named. When the story ended, Elias felt no need to speak. He simply turned his gaze inward
and listened. Not to thoughts, not to memory, but to something more spacious. After some time, he whispered, "There's nothing left to ask." The man in gray robes smiled. That's when the path becomes real. When you walk, not to arrive, but to disappear. Elias opened his eyes. The sun had gone, but the light hadn't. The world didn't feel different, only more honest. He stood, faced the old tree one last time, bowed, and turned toward the path he no longer needed to follow to know it would carry him. And in the space behind his footsteps, only silence remained, the kind of silence that listens back. Dear traveler of the night, if you've made it this far, through 25 stories whispered gently into your heart, then perhaps you've already begun to feel it. The quiet shift, the soft untying of all the knots you once held so tightly. We didn't promise answers. Zen rarely does. But perhaps in these parables, in the drifting leaves and silent stones, in the bamboo that bends and the bells that fade, you discovered something deeper than understanding. You found rest. In a world that rushes to fix, name, and control, may you learn to sit with the unknown like an old friend. May you walk the winding path not to arrive, but to listen. And when tomorrow comes with its winds and worries, remember this. You don't have to know what's next. You only have to be here, still, breathing, present. Thank you for listening. Thank you for being. And thank you for trusting the silence between our words. Until next time, sleep well, dear soul. You are already where you need to be.